Ethan Callaway was a 42-year-old widower and devoted father who had built a quiet reputation as one of the most precise treasury analysts at Blackridge Meridian Corporation in New York City. For 8 years, he had handled complex financing structures while raising his 10-year-old son, Lucas, alone with patience and determination. Ethan had earned his finance degree from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland before returning to the United States. His international education gave him a deep understanding of European lending practices, cross-border debt agreements, and banking regulations. He rarely mentioned his achievements because he believed competence should speak louder than impressive titles or expensive credentials. Blackridge Meridian was preparing for a massive refinancing worth more than $2 billion. The financing would be arranged through Helvetia Crown Bank, a respected Zurich institution with major American clients. Senior executives were preparing presentations for the bank's delegation, and Ethan was assigned to review the financial model before the final negotiations began. While examining the documents late one evening, Ethan noticed something troubling. A leverage covenant appeared significantly more restrictive than management had discussed. Then he discovered that a Swiss lending definition had been translated incorrectly, potentially changing how the company's debt ratio would be calculated under the agreement. Ethan continued reviewing the package carefully and found something even more serious. A $180 million obligation was missing from the company's financial model. If the obligation were included, the company's leverage position would look dramatically different. Ethan immediately documented his findings and sent a detailed email to the chief financial officer and several senior executives. 11 days passed without a meaningful response. Instead, Ethan received an invitation to an executive meeting where the refinancing presentation would be finalized. He arrived with his notes, expecting the leadership team to discuss his concerns. Instead, CEO Caroline Whitmore entered carrying Ethan's Swiss diploma in a presentation folder. She held it up in front of the executives and smiled sarcastically. Apparently, this expensive piece of Swiss paper makes Ethan our international banking expert. Several executives laughed awkwardly. Ethan remained silent. Caroline continued, saying that American finance was different from European classrooms and that the company needed practical executives, not academic theories. Ethan calmly explained that his concerns were based on the actual lending documents, not academic theory. Caroline interrupted him before he could finish. She removed him from the refinancing presentation team and reassigned him to support duties. Ethan collected his papers without arguing, knowing that the documents and his original email spoke for themselves. That evening, Ethan returned home to Lucas, who was working on a school project at the kitchen table. His son immediately noticed something was wrong. Ethan explained that sometimes people didn't appreciate warnings until consequences forced them to listen. Lucas asked whether his father was angry. Ethan smiled and said, "I'm disappointed, but I'm not going to stop doing the right thing." 3 days later, Helvetia Crown Bank's delegation arrived in Manhattan for the refinancing negotiations. Executives from Blackridge Meridian gathered inside a polished conference room, expecting an ordinary presentation. Caroline stood confidently near the center, while Ethan worked quietly outside the room, preparing documents for another department, as he had been instructed. Suddenly, the conference room doors opened. A senior Swiss banker named Daniel Mercer entered with his delegation. He scanned the room briefly before noticing Ethan through the glass wall. Daniel stopped immediately, walked across the hallway, and extended his hand. "Chairman Callaway," he said warmly. "It's been far too long, boss." The room became silent. Caroline stared at Ethan in disbelief. She looked at Daniel, then back at Ethan. "Chairman?" she whispered. Daniel explained that Ethan had been one of the founding executives who helped restructure Helvetia Crown Bank years earlier during a difficult period in its history. Ethan had later stepped away from active leadership to raise Lucas after his wife's death. However, he remained one of the bank's largest individual shareholders and maintained strong relationships with its senior leadership. Daniel explained that Ethan's strategic work had helped transform the institution into one of Switzerland's most respected private banking organizations. Caroline's expression changed completely, but Daniel wasn't finished. He opened a folder and placed the refinancing documents on the table. "Before we proceed," he said, "our legal and credit teams need clarification regarding an obligation valued at $180 million that appears to have been excluded from your model." Nobody spoke. Ethan quietly looked toward the CFO. Daniel continued, explaining that the missing obligation materially affected the company's leverage ratio. He also confirmed that the Swiss lending definition Ethan had flagged had been mistranslated, and that the covenant Ethan identified created substantial financial risk. Caroline immediately asked whether Ethan had informed the company. Daniel looked at her with disbelief. 11 days ago, he replied. His email was included in the documents our compliance team received after the internal review began. The room became tense. Ethan's warning had been officially documented long before the bank discovered the discrepancies independently. Helvetia Crown Bank immediately suspended the $2 billion refinancing. Its legal department requested every version of the financial model internal, communication, and approval record. Blackridge Meridian's board launched an independent investigation into the company's financial reporting practices and the treatment of employees who had raised concerns. Caroline attempted to defend herself, saying she had never intended to dismiss Ethan's expertise, but the recorded meeting told a different story. Her comments about his Swiss education, the removal from the presentation, and the decision to ignore his documented warnings were reviewed by the board. Within weeks, several senior executives were placed on administrative leave while investigators examined whether the missing obligation had been intentionally excluded. Ethan was asked to join the independent review committee, but he accepted only after ensuring that the investigation would remain completely impartial. The refinancing was eventually renegotiated under stricter financial controls. Ethan's original calculations proved accurate, saving the company from entering an agreement that could have created severe financial pressure. The board offered him a promotion to Chief Treasury Officer, but Ethan first asked for something more important: stronger protections for employees who reported financial risks. Months later, Ethan arrived home to find Lucas waiting at the door with a handmade drawing. "Dad, you're famous at work now," his son joked. Ethan laughed and hugged him. He knew the real lesson wasn't about Switzerland, banking, or being called boss. It was about staying honest when powerful people refused to listen. Ethan never publicly discussed the humiliation he had experienced in that executive conference room. He simply returned to his work, continued raising Lucas, and earned the respect of colleagues who had once underestimated him. Caroline eventually resigned, while the company rebuilt its leadership around transparency, accountability, and professional expertise. The most important moment, however, remained the day Daniel Mercer walked across that room and called Ethan boss. It wasn't the title that mattered. It was the reminder that true expertise doesn't always announce itself, and a person who quietly knows the truth can become the most important voice in the room.